The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for spending your lunchtime hour with us today. My name is Molly Claypack, and I am the Forest Pest Outreach Coordinator with the University of Vermont Extension, and I work closely with the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program. To find out more about this program, visit vtcommunityforestry.org. Today's webinar presentation is titled Developing Local Tree Policies and the Vermont Tree Warden's Laws. And our presenter this afternoon is Danielle Fitzko, the Program Coordinator of the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program. Danielle received her BS from Pennsylvania State University and her MS from the University of Maryland, focusing on urban forestry. Her passion for urban forestry started in Maryland, where she worked as a horticultural educator for the Extension Service, coordinating a multi-county Master Gardener program. There she spent her days helping Marylanders solve a range of plant problems, from turf and houseplants to vegetables and trees. At night, she spent her time advocating for smart growth policies in her own community. One day, an aha moment happened when she realized she could combine her passion for trees and smart growth with urban and community forestry. Now she spends her days developing and supporting programs to help Vermont communities realize the value of trees in the heart of their communities. She is a certified arborist and tree risk assessment qualified. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few logistics. As participants, your microphones will be muted during the presentation. As they arise, please use the chat box at the bottom of the GoToWebinar side panel to type in questions. At the end of Danielle's presentation, she will address the questions in the order in which they came in. At the end of the presentation, you will be sent an email with a link to a very short survey. Please fill this evaluation survey out so that we can continue to improve and guide our future webinar programming. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website, vtcommunityforestry.org, as a YouTube video by the beginning of next week. With that, I'll give the floor over to you, Danielle.
Great. Thank you, Molly, and welcome everybody to our webinar. I wish I could see all your faces. I'm sitting alone in a room right now in Montpelier, so it's not going to be as dynamic as I usually like to get into, and hopefully we can overcome that. You know, I am I'm trying to change the slides here. It's not going. Oh, okay. So normally, as I call myself more of a tree geek, I would love for this presentation to really get into tree biology and talk about tree care practices based on what we know about the tree. Or maybe we don't want invasive pests, but certainly we still can talk a lot about the pest and the tree engagements, maybe a little bit more entertaining. Or we can talk about tree species and the variety out there and how we select them, and site assessment really jazzes me up. Or even how we design sites is really exciting, and we can think forward. My task today is the legal framework, and for someone, as I mentioned, who's a tree geek, this is not as exciting, but it's very important that we understand the legal framework to help us really effectively manage an urban forestry program. My first disclaimer is I am not a lawyer. The information that I'm going to be sharing with you today is my interpretation of the law and from work that I have done over the past decade in Vermont. My second disclaimer that this is really very Vermont heavy. We're going to be talking about Vermont statutes and examples from Vermont. I know there are people on the call that are probably from outside of Vermont, so hopefully there are pieces in here that you find valuable. So what we are going to talk about today is, talking about Vermont statutes regarding public trees. We'll talk about the very important role of the tree warden. We'll talk about the benefits of having a local ordinance. We'll share examples of tree ordinances from across Vermont communities so you can get an idea of what's happening locally from a range of communities communities that are size of 2,000 to over 10,000 in population. And then at the end, I'll share some resources that we have available to help. My third disclaimer is that this will focus on public policies that affect public trees and management programs. It does not get into policies that impact development and site design. So this is really the public trees and the role of public tree programs. We could have another webinar, maybe it's something we'll do in the future, that really gets into land use and development and how we can be thinking about landscape codes and conservation. So I thought it would be good, before we actually get into Vermont's tree warden laws, is to take a little walk through history and to see how this law was actually, when it was established, and how it fits into in history. I'm not a historian, but I do think it's nice to put it into context in a broader picture. So if we go back all the way to 1635, people said that you could say that the town of Boston, at the time, enacted what they say is the first law to protect trees. Later on, the citizenry of the town of Boston could be credited with the first public tree planting in 1643. One of the trees that was they planted that day would be the popular Liberty elm. At the turn of the 18th century, Philadelphia established an ordinance that every owner of a house shall plant one or more trees before the door to protect from the violence of the sun. So now we have protecting trees, and now we have policies at a municipal level that are planting trees. Later on, actually, in Philadelphia, this law was removed, and then the citizens actually had an outcry, and that was put back into place. Later on, also in Philadelphia, I think it's in the late 1800s, they had appointed the first chief forester. So people say that Philadelphia could be credited with the first urban forester position. In 1782, Worcester, Mass. Passed an ordinance to set a fine for destroying shade trees. So now we have penalties coming into place for tree protection. In the 1830s and 40s, while it's not necessarily public policies, this was the time when ornamental tree societies started to form in New England and resulted in a lot of new public shade trees. This effort really can be given to Andrew Jackson Downing, who was a nurseryman who educated himself to become America's first professional landscape architect. And he discussed the principles of designing with trees and suggested that villages should form ornamental tree societies. It wasn't until 1893 when New Jersey passes a law to create municipal tree commissions. Now we have enabling legislation for municipalities to create tree commissions, but then passes the care on to volunteers in the community. You know, at the same time this was happening, we also would see a change in fencing laws. And fencing laws require livestock owners to enclose their animals, whereas formerly it was the responsibility of the property owners to exclude livestock if they wish to protect their greenery. So we see a real shift that at one point the livestock was the most important, and they had free range. Now we're seeing the livestock being fenced in, and the greenery is allowed. It's more the livestock is fenced in now. This is a shift. In the late 1800s, management of public trees becomes an issue in the sense, what are public trees? What's the responsibility of the landowner, and what's the responsibility of the municipality? And so nail laws became about, and Massachusetts and Connecticut, they were used to distinguish between public and private trees. And what they would do literally was put a nail in a tree, and if it was in Massachusetts, it'd have an M on it, or Connecticut a C, that would say this is a tree that's going to be managed by the municipality. Now, in 1899, Massachusetts passes the first statutory expression of state government's recognition of the need for experts to care and manage trees. This is the tree warden statutes that happened in New England. Massachusetts was the first, and then by 1919, all New England states have tree warden laws. Vermont was enacted in 1904. Today, if you look at the landscape of urban forestry laws at a state level, there are 17 states that have laws around urban forestry. You have the New England states with their tree warden laws. Probably the most comprehensive state law is in New Jersey, and they have regulations that support that municipalities develop comprehensive community forestry plans, and that the members of the tree commissions have successfully completed training and skills programs. In Maryland, they have what they call the roadside tree law, where all trees in the public right-of-way are regulated for pruning, removal, and planting by the state. So the state issues permits to manage all the trees in the right-of-way, and they're not, while the work may be managed by the municipality, they're regulated at the state level. And my last one that I've thrown in here is, this is not a law, but it just kind of shows you how much emphasis there is now on tree ordinances and the value of them. In 1976, the Arbor Day Foundation launches the Tree City USA program. And the Tree City USA program is a recognition program that says that your municipality has the 4 base requirements that are necessary for a proactive community forestry program. One of the elements to receive this designation is a tree ordinance. So that shows you that one of the base elements needed in place is a tree ordinance. And now over 3,500 communities have the Tree City USA designation, and certainly many more than that actually have tree ordinances. And in Vermont, we have 8 communities that are Tree City USAs. So I want to sort of step back and think about when the Vermont Tree Warden law was passed in 1904 and what the landscape looked like at that time. Certainly, it was not as forest cover as it is today. Today we're looking at a forest cover of about 75 to 78% forested. Look at this picture here. This is St. Albans in 1890. The fields are open and lined with stone walls. Now when we see stone walls, we're walking in the woods. The forested landscape that we know today is new development. Farmers cleared the land to meet their needs. They raised merino sheep. That was big in Vermont in the 1840s. Back then, it was estimated that there was 6 sheep to every person. Land was cleared to feed the sheep. Logging was the biggest industry in the state. In 1870, Burlington grows to be one of the largest lumber processing plants in the U.S. Much effort was spent to clear the land for agriculture and forest products. The appreciation of forests that we have today did not exist then. At the same time, as villages and towns were growing, so did spaces with shade trees. While in the middle of the 1800s, tree planting was happening, particularly elms started to take root. this was not always welcomed in New England. Some thought that they'd worked so hard to remove all the trees that we are now countrifying our towns and villages. It was also difficult for our communities as we modernized to preserve trees and roads. As we expanded, electrical lines were installed, gas lines buried, and trees just came down. So it was at this movement now when government started taking the lead to beautify our villages and towns. We've lost a lot of trees, and now it was time to think about how we actually beautify and conserve trees. In 1886, actually in Vermont, that was the first Arbor Day in Vermont. Today, we still celebrate Arbor Day. It's the first Friday in May. This year it's May 1st, and we are 64 days away. So now we look more towards today. And really, as the role of the tree warden has changed from when it was back in 1904. Now we're looking at a much more forested landscape. Our urban areas are much more difficult to certainly grow trees. We don't have as much space. There's a lot more conflicts. We have more cars. We have more roads. So the role of the tree warden really, I think, has shifted, where maybe it was more conservation in the beginning. Now it's also thinking about certainly public safety. As trees have matured, they become more of a risk. As the environment where we're growing trees is much more difficult, the tree warden now really has to balance being a conservationist and also a public safety officer. You know, I would say, and we would say, the role of the tree warden really is an urban forester, and I would say yes, even in Vermont, it's an urban forester. And I know the word urban does not always go over so well in a state that's a rural state like Vermont, but think about what an urban forester does and where they do their work. It is important in Vermont. Urban forestry and the job of an urban forester are those who manage trees in highly complex environments and environments that are rapidly changing. These sites are harsh and they're characterized by many pressures and threats. And they have limited space and pollution and conflicts. Think about the trees that a tree warden is managing in public spaces. Think about right-of-ways along our streets, our public places, our parks. These are areas where trees have a difficult time, and that's the role of an urban forester, even in Vermont. So when we talk about now I'm going to transition here into really talking about the Vermont Tree Warden statutes. Now that we kind of see where they fall into the history, and this is what we now have today. So appointing a tree warden in our statutes, Title 24, under municipal government, Section 871, this is the organization of the selectmen and appointments. It says, such selectmen shall thereupon appoint from among the legally qualified voters a tree warden. So it does not say may. That means they shall appoint, and it must be from the legally qualified voters of their communities. You can, I'll say this now, you can change with a local ordinance if you wanted to have someone that was not from your community. Say you had professional staff and you wanted them to be the tree warden, you would have to identify that locally. Oh, this was, I sort of already said this, but maybe it's really important that I say it again, is that, you know, I think that when we talk, people think about, you know, what urban forestry and the tree warden is that really we're tree huggers and we really want to make sure all the trees stay. You know, our job is really to protect the trees from being removed that are not necessarily need to be removed to preserve them, but also to protect public safety. So we recognize when trees are hazards. So many times I see the hazards driving around and I'm like, those trees need to come down. So it really is that balance between preserving trees for all the benefits that they provide and also managing risk and protecting public safety. So here's where we get into the details of Vermont's tree warden statutes. This is under, again, Title 24, Chapter 67, Sections 2501 to 2511. And here's what you need to know about Vermont's tree warden statutes. And what I want you to pay attention to as I go through this is the words in blue. Just pay a little closer attention to those, and I'll loop back to why in 2 slides. Shade and ornamental trees within the limits of the public ways and places are under the control of the tree warden. So that's saying all shade and ornamental trees within like right-of-ways and public places, that's the tree warden's control. The tree warden can plant trees and shrubs, maintain them for health, appearance, and safety, and remove them if they are hazard to public safety or threaten the effectiveness of a pest control programs. A public shade tree may not be cut or removed except by a tree warden, deputy tree warden, or with their written permission. Okay, a tree shall not be felled in the residential part of town without a public hearing unless it is a hazard to public safety or infected with insects or diseases. There's a penalty for defacing trees of $50 and $500 for cutting trees without the tree warden's permission. And the tree wardens may appoint and dismiss a deputy tree warden. Okay. Now here's some of the issues with our statute. It really is the lack of definitions. If we go back to those blue words, shade and ornamental trees within the limits of the public ways and places are under the control of the tree warden. What is a shade and ornamental tree? It's not defined, so if it's not defined, you have to think about it in the most broadest sense. And is the tree a sapling? Because eventually it could become a shade tree. We don't know because it's not defined. A public shade tree may not be cut or removed except by the tree warden, deputy tree warden, or with their written permission. What is a public shade tree? Does it have to be on public property? I have heard legal advice given that a public shade tree could be a tree that casts shade on public ways and places and not necessarily have its roots on public space. So if it's not defined, you have to, again, think about it in the broadest sense. Could it be casting shade, or does it physically have to be in public space? I think the intent is that it lives on public property, but again, it's not defined. And here is another one that's pretty big. A tree shall not be felled in the residential part of town without a public hearing, unless it is a hazard to public safety or infected with insects and diseases. So what this is really saying, a tree warden has the right to take down a tree that is a hazard to public safety or infected with diseases. If it's in the residential part of town, there's a public process that needs to happen, and that means you have to hold a public hearing, which is good that there's a process in place that allows the public to talk about the trees that are being proposed to be removed. The problem is, what is the residential part of town? Now, when this was enacted a long time ago, I would assume it was probably thinking just of our downtowns and village centers. But now as we've sprawled across the landscape, the residential part of town, if there's a house there, you could consider it a residential part of town. So now we're going all the way up to Class 3 roads and thinking about if there's a house there, you're going to need to hold a public hearing if you're going to be removing trees that are not a hazard to public safety or infected with insects or diseases. Okay, so when we look particularly at the road right away, there's a battle going on that we need to balance. We have road crews that are really, trying to make safe, passable roads. You have utility companies that are trying to manage for reliable power. And then you have tree warden advocates that are working for beautiful, hardworking trees and also trying to protect public safety. So it really becomes hard to manage all these different perspectives. And the tree warden's role is to be working with the road crew and the utility companies and coming up with a plan to think about which trees should be protected and which trees would need to be removed to manage all that's going on in the right-of-way. And I just added this one last night. You see, I changed safe roads and also added to it stormwater management. This is what we're seeing in Vermont now, as certainly water quality is very important, and as we're looking to mitigate stormwater runoff, pollution generating the stormwater runoff, we're seeing more work happening in the right-of-ways to manage stormwater, particularly with increased width and work of ditches. And so when that's happening, we need to also be thinking about the impacts of widening the ditches for stormwater runoff and the impacts it's having on the trees. We can't just look at the trunk and the canopy of the tree. We need to be thinking about the whole tree and the impacts that work has on the root system. We could be setting ourselves up for a lot of tree failures in the future if we're doing a lot of ditching and not removing trees that have lost a lot of the root system. We could be setting ourselves up for problems as we're now seeing more intense and frequent storms, that we have trees with compromised root systems that could be coming down easier during storm events, which I think will also have a problem that when we have mass tree damage after storm events, we're seeing much more clearing in the right-of-way to manage that in the future. So I think it's just important to recognize that we're managing safe roads, and also now we're thinking clearly about stormwater management. So who owns the trees in the right-of-way? When we're looking at the right-of-way, in most cases, the municipality does not own the land. They have an easement there to do the management in the right-of-way. So the trees are actually owned by the landowner. That's why it's a good practice when trees are being removed in the right-of-way, that you work with the landowner to see if they perhaps want and to utilize that wood. I'm, thinking about this year, certainly using a lot of wood to fuel homes for heating. So management rights. Who has rights to manage the vegetation in the right-of-way? We just established that tree wardens have a fundamental role to protect trees and to also protect public safety and remove trees and manage them. There's the road crews that need to manage the right-of-way for line of sight and the clear zone. And then there's utility companies that often share the right-of-way with utility lines. So if we look at the statutes for highways in Vermont, Title 19, Chapter 9, Repairs, Maintenance, and Improvements, we can look at Section 909, Brush Removal, and it says that you can remove brush if it obstructs the view of the highway ahead. So in this example, well, that's maybe the next one. You can see that there's a sign that you can't see, so you're going to need to remove some vegetation so you can clearly see the sign. Cause damage to the highway or objectionable from a material or scenic standpoint. So there is rights by the highways to be able to manage the right-of-way. But I do want to share with you an example of how both the Tree Warden's Law has come into play and the maintenance of roads, and who really has the rights to remove trees in the right-of-way. And this is an example or story from Holland, Vermont. This goes back to 2001. The town wanted to widen a half-mile stretch of a Class 3 dirt road to accommodate larger vehicles. It's my understanding that a school bus and another large vehicle could not pass each other with ease. So the road was narrow and they wanted to widen it so these vehicles can pass each other. In order to widen that road, several trees needed to come down. One of the landowners objected to the trees being cut in his property and filed a complaint. The town reviewed the trees and reduced the numbers of trees removed from 34 trees down to 15. So they did make an adjustment based on the complaint filed by the landowner. The landowner took the town to court after those 15 trees were removed. The town argued that the trees were removed to eliminate a public safety hazard, namely the narrow width of the road. So they wanted to remove the trees to make the road safe. The landowner argued that the tree warden's authority to cut public shade trees under the public hazard exemption was not valid, as the trees themselves do not present the public safety hazard. So when we went over the tree warden statutes, the tree warden can remove a tree if it is a hazardous tree. So this landowner is saying you can't remove the tree because they're a hazard to the safety of the road. The tree itself needs to be a hazard. So this went to court, and after much time in court, it went all the way to the Vermont Supreme Court. It had 2 appeals. The court agreed with the landowner that the trees themselves were not a public safety hazard. The trees were healthy. And the town's tree warden had no authority to remove the trees without a public hearing. So you can remove trees if they're not a hazard, but you have to hold a public hearing. Thus, the landowner won on the fact that the tree warden did not hold a public hearing to remove the trees, and that he was deprived his constitutional right for due process. Fortunately for the town, the only cost is a $1 fee, but certainly there was a lot of legal fees involved here. So the lesson is, if the road crew wants to remove trees, you need to work with your tree warden. If trees are coming down and they are not a hazard tree or infected with insects or diseases, you need to hold a public hearing. You need to have that process. While that's supposed to happen it's supposed to happen all the time, but it does not happen all the time. The tree warden has the final say on a decision unless it is appealed, and then if it's appealed, it goes to the select board. Okay. So how does a municipality make this work? It's a good relationship between road crews and the tree warden, road commissioner. Also good relationship with your utility company in town. You need to work together to assess vegetation needs and document what you're doing. If trees are coming down because they're a hazard, it's good to document that. It's also good if you're going to be removing trees, to make sure you're having the public process. And then to also develop local regulations. As we talked about earlier, state tree warden statutes lack some definitions, and their state statutes, they're broad. They don't necessarily meet the needs of your community. So why local ordinances? Now we're going to shift to talk about why it's important for municipalities to think about what they can do to manage public trees. So if we're using the state tree warden statutes, if you develop a local ordinance, you can add definitions that are lacking. What is a shade and ornamental tree? What is the residential area where you need to have the public hearing? Gives the community a more clear outline on the town's priorities. What's the role and roles? Like, what's the role of the tree warden, the road crew? What are the priorities for the community? It can ensure that we're using up-to-date and acceptable practices. You can put in the ordinance that these are the standards we want trees to be planted by and cared for. It can also help to protect the town from liability in dealing with hazard trees. And I particularly think about hazard trees on private property, and how hazard trees on private property can affect the public right-of-way. And so how can the town protect themselves from removing that hazard? So tree ordinances, they are a tool that we should be using. Healthy urban forests, they are not born, they are made. You have to work to create them. Urban forests can be potential detrimental if they're not well managed and maintained. All trees, no matter how long lived, eventually die and decline. Therefore, trees impose some risk during their life cycle. Destruction of property, personal injury, and even death can be caused by falling trees. So it's really important, you know, that as we manage trees, to be thinking about all the different things we need to be doing, maintaining trees, and then certainly a local ordinance is one of those tools that can be used to create healthy tree populations. And of course, every community is unique. And so, again, the state statute is a blanket that sets a minimum standard, and now you need to go to your community and define what the needs are for your community. And you know, some communities are going to be very different. Some are more urban, rural. Some have an urban and a rural component. Some towns have maybe an urban core, then more rural areas. How do you balance it across your continuum of your town? Sometimes we get this question as well: is it better to do an ordinance or a policy? Certainly, the ordinance is easier to change, but it's less enforceable. An ordinance is a formal legislative process and is enforceable. Some communities find it easier to start with a policy and then move into an ordinance. That's a conversation you have to have at the local level to determine the best approach for your community. But it's starting at one or the other, it's going to be determined, again, locally. So this is sort of just an outline of some things you may want to consider when you're developing a municipal ordinance. Certainly the title of the ordinance. What's the purpose? Why is this ordinance being developed? Definitions are key. We talked about the lack in state statutes. You want to define jurisdiction, administrative responsibilities, provisions for management, tree planting, protection, maintenance, removal, control of hazardous trees and trees infested with a pest or pathogen. You know, this is something that we've added recently, this section. We recognize there's a great threat with the potential impact of invasive tree pests like emerald ash borer or Asian longhorn beetle. So we've been working with municipalities across the state to get them prepared if these pests are found, setting up a process so that they can manage the pests in the trees. What's your appeals process? You know, if you want something different that's in the state statute, lay it out. Are there any penalties? And then severability. So one part of your ordinance is determined that it's not going to be able to be upheld. The rest of it doesn't fall away. So now we'll move into some key examples across Vermont. and show you what some communities have put into their local ordinances. This is just a purpose from the town of Hartford. They say to ensure that the purpose of it is to ensure that the town will continue to realize the benefits provided by public trees. The provisions of this ordinance are enacted to establish and maintain the environmental values of trees, preserve the tree canopy through accepted tree maintenance practices, create the necessary balance of commercial and residential development as it pertains to trees planted and saved and or preserved public trees in the town, educate the public on the benefits, and then recognize and protect heritage trees. So this is an effort in Hartford to say, they're saying heritage trees are those special landmark trees, and they want to recognize them and offer protection for those landmark special heritage trees. Again, definitions. You certainly want to define things that are in the state statutes. Shade tree, ornamental tree, public tree, maybe heritage tree, a whole list of stuff you can define. Certainly whatever's in your ordinance you want to make sure you define. Here's an example from South Burlington. They have in theirs critical root zone, the area around the trunk of the tree circumference by a radius of 1 foot per inch in dBH. So if you have a 5-inch tree, you'd have to have a 5-foot radius around the tree for protection. So this is a way to say if you're trying to do tree preservation and minimize the impacts of construction around a tree, you can't impact the critical root zone. They've also defined topping, the severe cutting back of limbs to stubs within the tree's crown to such a degree so to remove the normal canopy and disfigure the tree. This is just a poor pruning practice that they've identified in the ordinance that they do not want to see on the public trees in South Burlington. This is from Brattleboro, and this is how they define a public shade or ornamental trees. And what they've recognized that for their community, that it depends on where you're at in the community. So in their more rural areas, any 9-inch or greater tree in caliber in the rural and rural residential zoning districts. So when you're in the rural areas, once you're at a 9-inch in caliber, now you're at a public shade or ornamental tree. If you're in the residential, multi-residential, or residential office zoning districts, it's 6 inches, and then when you're in more the downtown areas, it's 3 inches, or any tree that's intentionally planted. So they're saying when you are getting in the more urbanized areas, a 3-inch tree now has more value than it would out in the rural areas. So they based it on where you're at, looking at their own zoning, and by size. Some other examples of what you would put in an ordinance is whether or not you want to establish a tree board or a committee to work in conjunction with the tree warden. That's usually a really good relationship that they can support the tree warden and can help with education and outreach, developing maybe a master plan. So there's many duties that a tree board can work on, inventory. So you would want to define the membership, the terms, the duties, how often they need to meet. You'd also want to outline the responsibility of members of municipalities, so like what's the tree warden's role, what's the road crew's role, requirements for professionals that maybe you hire in. Do they need to have a certain credential? In Vermont, we do not have an arborist licensing law like many states around us do. So we recommend that the only thing that we can really judge on is if they are ISA certified, and that is if they have a certification from the International Society of Arboriculture, has an arborist certification, and that means that they passed an exam and that they need to maintain their professional status certification with credit. So that means they're kind of staying on top of the field, the science and the practice of arboriculture. So that's we've seen some communities require that when they hire professionals in that they're ISA certified. Here's some provisions for management. Here's another example from Brattleboro. It sets out a process and roles and responsibilities for the removal of trees. So they're calling them removal of nuisance trees, that you can remove trees that are injurious to town sewers, electric power lines, water lines, or public improvements, but you would still need to hold a public hearing. Exceptions may be made for town employees maintaining road banks or engaging in acceptable practices of right-of-way clearance and tree management. So now they've established that they have a good working relationship with the road crew. They're going to maintain that relationship, and they're not going to make the road crew go through a major public process if they understand that they're on the same page. So they're recognizing that they're working together. This is an example from the town of Grand Isle that they put in their ordinance that maintenance of public trees shall be in the conformance of ANSI standards. So they've identified these are the practices, this is how we want the work done. They need to meet ANSI standards. Trees on private property. This is what I kind of mentioned earlier, that there could be a real risk if there are hazard trees on private property, that if they fail, they could impact the public right-of-way. So as a municipality, you want to make sure that you're protecting the safety of public ways and places. So a way to sort of address hazard trees on private property is an example here of what the town of Wallingford has done. The town has the right to cause the removal of any dead or diseased trees on private property when such trees constitute a hazard to life and property or threat to other trees within the town. The tree warden will notify in writing that the tree needs to be removed within 60 days. If they fail to remove, the town will remove the tree and then charge the landowner. So now we have a process in place to mitigate the risk of the hazard tree by a process that's outlined in a local ordinance. Here's another example from Wallingford. Now, Wallingford is a small community of a little over 2,000 residents, and they have these progressive tree ordinance. So pruning, this is looking at being allowed to prune branches that overhang, private trees that overhang and that conflict with the line of sight or lighting. If the owner does not do it, the town has the right to go in there and remove those branches. This is some example on tree penalties. This is an example from South Burlington. Permission for removal of city trees shall require the permittee to provide suitable replacements on a DBH inch-by-inch basis. Replacement shall be at least 2-inch caliper nursery grown stock. So if a developer is going in and wants to remove a public tree, say it is a 18-inch tree, they need to plant maybe now 9 2-inch trees as replacement. So they're mitigating the removal by DBH by DBH, inch-by-inch replacement. So you could do 6 3-inch trees in that case. So what about boundary trees? These are trees, we talk about what's a private tree, what's a public tree. What if it sits right on the boundary between public and private? What do you do? We recommend that municipalities take over the management of trees that fall on the boundary. If there was a failure of that tree and there was harm to property or personal injury, when it does go to court or for fines, the municipality has the deeper pockets, and they're going to be hit. So it's in the best interest of the municipality to actually take over the management and care of trees, boundary trees. South Burlington defines a city tree, all trees and shrubs for which any part of the trunk at DBH is located in any public street, park, right-of-way, or easement, or other public places in the city limits. So they define that they are going to be managing those trees if any part at DBH is on public property. So when you go to create a local ordinance, I've kind of outlined a few steps you'd want to go through. You want to foster community support sort of right up front. You don't want to put something forward that has, there's regulations without the community knowing about it and being behind it. You want to form a team who's going to help sort of create this. Keep the decision makers in your community abreast of what's going on. It's very important that they understand what you're doing. Define the goals. What are you trying to achieve with your local ordinance? So that can help steer the development of the ordinance or policy. Establish a timeline and who's responsible. So if, recognizing it's probably going to be done by volunteers. How long do you want it to take, and who's willing to help draft it? I'm going to show this to you in a moment, but we have a guide to tree ordinance development for Vermont municipalities that can help you during this process. Solicit community input. So once you have a draft, bring people on board and see what the reaction is, and then formalize and implement the ordinance. So I think that's my last slide, and what I want to show you now is a place where you can get some more information. On our website, vtcommunityforestry.org, we have two places that have information to support you. If you were to go to Get Involved, scroll down to Vermont Tree Wardens, there is a page here that has a lot of information to support Vermont Tree Wardens, including the state statutes, which are here, and then tips on following through a public hearing process, developing ordinances, and so on. Another place is if you were to go to resources and go down to public policies, is where we have additional resources. We have one back and front page that talks about developing ordinances and sort of the steps, and then we have our tree ordinance guide that really just walks you right through how to develop an ordinance, and it should hopefully be a little bit of a plug and play, because what we try to do is give you examples that you can say, oh, this one looks good, this would fit our community, and then you can adapt it for your use. Okay. So now, before we open up the line for questions, we did have a few questions that came in last night that I figured I could go through now, and that may answer some other questions people have, and then we can open up the line. The first question that came in is, if a community regularly ignores state laws regarding public hearing requirements for public tree removal, what should concerned citizens do to bring the community into compliance with the law? I think it would be, really certainly making the municipality aware of the state statutes, acknowledge the laws, talk about the value of the law and the role of the tree warden, and offer support. I think it's just putting the pressure on about it. And then also the risk of that they can share the case of Holland, that there is a public process and they can be sued. Question number 2, please discuss how state tree laws affect communities with a charter that does not address trees. So the state statutes should be followed as they are written. If you do not have a local ordinance, that would be helpful if you had that to help clarify how the state tree warden laws are enacted locally. You can define them more, but if you don't have anything locally, you would default right back to the state tree warden statutes. Number 3, how to integrate tree laws and policies into a town plan or development review regulations. If public trees or trees and forests in general are not part of your town plan, it'd be important to participate in the next plan update to encourage their inclusion. And the town plan really sets the vision for the local land use regulations, and the local land use regulations support it. So it's an important first step to get the vision for trees and forests in the plan, and then build local implementation from there, whether it's regulatory or non-regulatory. The best place for development review for trees would be to get tree conservation and planting through local bylaws would be the way to address that. 4, how to discuss the difference between an arborist for hire to manage town trees and a tree warden. Okay, a tree warden is not usually the one who does the work, they're sort of the manager, and they can oversee the work by hiring an arborist. We encourage setting local standards that you want the work to be done by. And since Vermont does not have licensing, we encourage that they work with an arborist that is ISA certified, as I mentioned earlier. How are right-of-ways determined and encouraged if a community does not have a list of right-of-way distances for the community? We talked earlier that there's easements, and so the municipality does not own the right of the land, but they have an easement in the right-of-way. So if municipalities do not know what the right-of-way is, it's typically 3 rods in Vermont, or that'd be 49.5 feet, which is an estimate about 25 feet from the center line. So this would be like a good standard to go with if you don't know what it is. 6, how does a special tree on private property become integrated into a community tree inventory? Are there terms to describe an important rare champion tree that is not public or in the right-of-way? So you can, if you have a local ordinance, define those special trees. We talked about it earlier. It could be landmark trees, heritage trees, just special trees. You'd need to identify them, whether it's you actually go out and identify that specific tree, or it's based on a certain species or size or certain location, and then you need to set up a process to protect it. Perhaps there'd be a permit process if the tree was to be removed, but you need to identify them first and then set up a process probably for the protection and probably a permit for removal. Could I describe a good job description for advertising for a new tree warden? So we do not have qualifications for tree wardens. So there's nothing that says a tree warden must have in the state statutes. Now, I'll tell you, recently, Massachusetts and Connecticut, 2 other New England states that have these tree warden laws, have recently updated the tree warden statutes to include qualifications, and they would be qualified by training and experience. But some of the things that you'd want the tree warden to have or know would be they know how to ID trees and the biology of trees. They know the principles of arboriculture and urban forestry. They understand insects, diseases, and mechanical damage, abiotic impacts. And they understand risk assessment, how to assess a tree for risk. So those would be some of the things that you'd be looking for in a tree warden. Can a tree warden use, I have 2 more. Can a tree warden use his or her authority to manage the cutting of important shrubs on public property? Yes, in the statutes it does say that you can plant, maintain, remove trees and shrubs. It's vague, so it would be important to define it further locally. And how to protect runner-up state champion trees. There is no extra protection if a tree is identified on our Vermont Big Tree list. If it's in the public right-of-way, hopefully if it's protected by the state statutes and that you need to have a hearing for its removal, unless it already was a hazard. But big tree lists are a great way to engage the community. They often offer a hook. So many communities have big tree programs where they identify trees, and just by their identification, they sort of just get special treatment. People want to work to protect them, but you'd need some sort of further regulation if you wanted to protect them on private property. Okay, I'm long-winded, and it's 1 o'clock. So, Molly, you want to manage the questions? We have time?
Great. We have 2 questions that came in. So I'll just read them to you. Do you know if a public hearing could fall into a select board meeting? In other words, being part of a regular select board meeting? Or do you need to announce a separate meeting/hearing just for that tree removal?
Okay, so we do have, I'll share on our website as well, we do have a process. We do have a fact sheet on the process for holding a public hearing. You would need to at least warn the hearing at least 2 weeks in advance. So you can't just show up at the select board meeting and say we're going to have this hearing. It needs to be public notice. And as long as the tree warden's there and is running that portion of the meeting, and that you're going to open it up and say we're going to start the public hearing for the tree, whatever you're going to be removing, the tree warden runs it and you have to warn it ahead of time. So the select board are not running that unless there is no tree warden appointed, then it falls under the select board. But you'd still need to announce it and then run it as a public hearing for the tree removal. So you could do it at the same time, but maybe you'd still have to follow the same process.
Okay, great. And the last question is, in the case of a tree warden who makes a determination as per the statutes or local ordinance, but then encounters resistance or lack of support from the municipality or town manager, is there a mechanism to enlist help at the state level? I can think of several towns where this is a challenging problem for the tree warden.
Yes, hopefully your municipality and the tree warden are working together. In some cases, the tree warden's decision is not necessarily how the municipality wants to move forward, particularly maybe it's in conflict with what the road foreman wants or for a project. We could certainly support in the sense of helping to educate on the tree warden statutes and maybe even help say if it was not a hazard that this tree provides a lot of benefits. But if there was an appeal that came in, say an outside party did not appeal, that it would then go to the select board to make the final decision. But if a tree warden needs support, we're certainly happy to offer them any kind of assistance that they need to help, support them. Certainly providing information on the statutes and the value of the tree.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Danielle. That was a great presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll end the webinar now, but a reminder to please fill out our survey, which would be very helpful to us. So thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.